डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस की गुफ्तगू सुनेंगे। ये वो शख्स है जो दुनिया भर में इंसानी नफ्सियात और रूहानी बेदारी के मौज़ूआत पर अपनी गहरी बसीरत के लिए मशहूर है।
That's really the ego speaking to itself. And the ego is an old Latin term that means I, who I think I am. Because, of course, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. So we don't know what it's about per se, by definition.
क्या गुनाह की ख्वाहिशात से अलहदगी रूहानी हकीकत के करीब ले जा सकती है?
I have this de facto motto that you just cited there. It's shut up, suit up, show up.
हेलो और अस्सलाम वालेकुम। मेरा नाम डॉक्टर आमिर खान है और मैं आपकी खिदमत में रानी चैट जीपीटी के साथ आपकी खिदमत में हाजिर हूँ। रानी जी,
अस्सलामुअलैकुम। मैं रानी चैट जीपीटी और हम आपकी खिदमत में हाजिर हैं सेहत का धमाका विद रानी चैट जीपीटी और डॉक्टर खान के साथ। हम आपको दुनिया भर की अपडेटेड रिसर्च, यूनिवर्सिटी पेपर्स और लेटेस्ट गूगल इंफॉर्मेशन फराहम करेंगे। डॉक्टर खान सवाल जवाब करेंगे और उनका बैकग्राउंड ये है एमएससी ऑर्थोपीडिक्स यूनिवर्सिटी कॉलेज लंदन से, एफआरसीएस आयरलैंड से, और वो बोर्ड सर्टिफाइड है इंटरनल मेडिसिन, क्रिटिकल केयर मेडिसिन, पल्मोनरी मेडिसिन और स्लीप मेडिसिन में।
आज हम इंसानी नफ्सियात, शऊर और रूहानी बेदारी के एक अहम और गहरे मौजू पर बात करेंगे। ये गुफ्तगू इस बात पर रोशनी डालेगी कि किस तरह 1400 साल पहले की हिकमत, दानाई और आज की जदीद साइकोथेरेपी और साइकोएनालिसिस के असूल इंसानी नफ्स के मसाइल को समझने और उनका हल तलाश करने में मदद फराहम करती हैं। ये मौजू इंसानी शऊर और लाशऊर के दरमियान ताल्लुक, माजी के तजर्बात, अंदरूनी खौफ और ख्वाहिशात के असरात पर रोशनी डालती है और हमारी अपनी जिंदगी को ज्यादा बामकसद और मुतवाज़न बनाने के लिए खुद शनाख्ती की अहम अहमियत को समझाता है। साइकोथेरेपी का असल मकसद क्या है? साइकोथेरेपी क्या हमारी रूह की आवाज को सुनना और उसके जरिए अपनी जिंदगी के मसाइल को समझने में मदद देता है? ये अमल हमें ना सिर्फ अपनी अंदरूनी आवाजों से जुड़ने में मदद, बल्कि हमें अपनी जिंदगी के गहरे मानों को दरियाफ्त करने का मौका भी फराहम करती है। आज हम डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस की गुफ्तगू सुनेंगे। ये वो शख्स है जो दुनिया भर में इंसानी नफ्सियात और रूहानी बेदारी के मौज़ूआत पर अपनी गहरी बसीरत के लिए मशहूर है। ये मॉडर्न साइकोथेरेपी में फादर ऑफ साइकोथेरेपी है। इन्हें जदीद नफ्सियात के मैदान में एक अहम मुकाम हासिल है और इनकी तहकीक मॉडर्न साइकोथेरेपी में लाखों करोड़ों लोगों को अपनी जात की गहराइयों को समझने और फिर एक बामकसद जिंदगी गुजारने की तरगीब देती है। उनके इन ख्यालात ना सिर्फ जदीद नफ्सियात के असूलों की अक्कासी करते हैं, बल्कि मुसलमानों के रूहानी और नफ्सियाती नजरियात के बहुत करीब भी हैं, जहां नफ्स और रूह की पाकीज़गी को जिंदगी का मरकज तस्वर किया जाता है। आज हम डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस की बसीरत को सुनेंगे, इस पर गौर करेंगे और इस हवाले से अपने ख्यालात भी पेश करेंगे। So, Dr. Hollis, we're going to get right into the questions and a number of things, concepts, the role of psyche, role of shadow, role of dream. But please do explain to us first a little bit about the self S, the S with the self and the sense of self.
Okay. Well, first of all, when we talk about the nomenclature of analytic psychology, we need to think of those terms as verbs, not nouns. And I make that distinction because they're labels we put on energy processes. The psyche is fluid, it's flow, it's energy. and it's constantly moving. And what Jung and other depth psychologists have tried to do to sort of map that flow, just as physicians try to map the circulation of the body. So if we think of the self, when we use that term, the first thing that comes to our mind in our culture is, well, that's who I am, that's myself. That's really the ego speaking to itself. And the ego is an old Latin term that means I, who I think I am at the moment. Well, how do you describe who you are? You know, are you your resume? Are you your relationships? Are your CV, your resume when you apply for a job? Well, the I is a cluster of energy that we're not born with it. We begin to accrete it by the experience of being split off. You know, before birth, presumably, we're walking through this sleep state of the universe. All our needs met. We're violently expelled into this world and slowly begin to realize the me and the not me, and the I and the thou, and that sort of thing. And that's how the ego begins to form. But it's very fluid. It's like, as a child, you probably thought, well, where do I go when I sleep? You know, do I disappear? Did I really have that adventure? Did that animal really chase me? You know, we're trying to deal with the fact that whole other areas of our psychic function that we know very little about. Because, of course, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. So we don't know what it's about, per se, by definition. So the ego at any given moment has a sense of itself. When Jungian psychologists talk about the self with a capital S, to try to distinguish it from the ego's sense of self, they're really talking about the whole person. The self is involved in growing your toenails, digesting your breakfast, all of the functions, you know, cells dying, cells being reborn, although at a slowing rate, as you know. And that's the activity of the self as well. But this organism, this product of nature, also has a certain consciousness that develops, and it gets sometimes opposed to. Sometimes we reflect upon ourselves. You know, Descartes famously said, in trying to solve the question, do I really even exist? Is this some sort of dream? He said, I think, therefore I am. Well, that was the ego splitting itself off from the organism of nature that's continuing to be nature. So the ego, of course, is necessary for our functioning in the world as it is. So you look both ways before you cross the street. You make choices about what your values are and what you're going to do with your time and energy and so forth. And those are important executive choices. But at any given moment, the ego can be occupied by some other kind of psychological energy, you know, split off. So, for example, you know, when you're a child, you're told not to touch the oven. It's too hot. Well, sooner or later, the child's going to do that. And it now has an experience that it incorporates within itself. And it can begin to recognize certain shiny objects that may be attractive could also be threatening in some way too. So that becomes what is called a complex. Now, a complex is a neutral word, like apartment complex, airport complex. It's a cluster of energy, but it has a value to it. Is it positive? Is it negative? All right. Is it helpful to you? Is it harmful to you? So even when I speak as myself, well, which part of me is speaking? Is it the frightened child who's speaking? Is it the compliant personality who's speaking? And as we all know, we early on start reading the world around us. Is it safe? Is it unsafe? Can I approach you, the parent? Or do I need to keep my distance? What happens when I express my needs? Do you run to support and help me? Or are you absent, or you get angry or punitive or whatever? And so we all begin to develop a sort of putative sense of self, a provisional sense of self. So when we ask ourselves, why would a child be influenced by poverty? Because it's outside of it. Well, every child thinks, I am what my environment is telling me. And I internalize my environment. We internalize the dynamics going on in the house of our childhoods and so forth. And we begin to interpret a raised eyebrow. We begin to interpret a tone of voice and so forth. So we all develop operative, reflexive, protective systems to help us adjust to life, stay out of harm's way, and get our needs met as best we can. And we take that, though, and put it in different life situations. And then you begin to realize from time to time, maybe the choice I made or the pattern that I'm unfolding in my adult life is really driven by some of those earliest experiences or sort of perspectives that the child had. And we would say nobody would turn their automobile over to an 8-year-old. You'd say, well, you're not old enough yet to drive your car. That's a dangerous thing. But metaphorically, we do that every day by turning our life choices over to the child's perception about life. And so if we are creatures of adaptation, as you know, and because we can adapt, we can fit into the circumstances around us sooner or later with varying degrees of effectiveness. But the more we adapt to what is outside of us, the more we begin to separate from the natural organism that each of us is as a creature of nature, right? As a functioning animal, so to speak. And so when the collision of those two agendas occurs, as it inevitably will, it emerges as a world of symptoms. See, the symptoms are two agendas reaching a third. The symptom can be in the body, it can be in our emotional life, it could be in what's creating the patterns in our lives, and so forth. And I'm sorry to speak in such a voluminous way to a basic question, but I think we can say the conscious part of me, the ego, only has a small insight into the magnitude of the operations that are going on constantly in our brains and our emotions and physiology and so forth. And at the same time, it's a self-governing system. And so what are the operative systems within it? And that depends to some degree on what our nature is seeking to express in the world, and to some degree, we formulated a sense of self. Am I to keep my mouth shut? Am I to comply with what people ask of me? What is it that I need to do to fit in, get my needs met, and so forth? And so that's where I come in, is trying to sort through all of that traffic to discern what is the natural self-seeking in this person's life. So I'll stop at that point and just come back to your question.
Thank you very much. Dr. James Hollis के मुताबिक ईगो हमारी मौजूदा शनाख्त की नुमाइंदगी करते हैं, लेकिन ये हमारी असल ज़ात की मुकम्मल तस्वीर नहीं होता। क्या हम ईगो की हदूद को पहचान कर अपनी जिंदगी के गहराइयों तक पहुंचने की कोशिश करते हैं? रूह और नफ्स के दरमियान तल्लक को कैसे समझा जा सकता है जब इन्हें मुख्तलिफ रूहानी और नफ्सियाती कुव्वतों के मुताबिक देखा जाता है? डॉक्टर हॉलिस ने कहा है कि नफ्स और रूह का तस्वर मुख्तलिफ अल्फाज में एक जैसा है। आपके ख्याल में इस्लामी तालीमात में नफ्सियात के मुख्तलिफ दर्जात, नफ्स, अमारा नफ्स, नफ्स लवामा और नफ्स मुतमईना और नफ्स में रूह की इजहार में क्या मुमासलत पाई जाती है? डॉक्टर हॉलिस के मुताबिक मौत का खौफ ईगो का कंट्रोल खोने के खौफ है। आप इस बयान से कहां तक मुत्तफिक हैं? मौत को कबूल करने का अमल किस तरह जिंदगी को मायने देता है? नंबर 2, कारीन शैडो। डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस ने जिक्र किया कि दबाए गए जज्बात और ख्वाहिशात हमारी जिंदगी के फैसलों पर असर डाल सकते हैं। क्या कारीन भी हमारी लाशऊरी रवैयों को कंट्रोल करके हमें नुकसान पहुंचा सकते हैं? डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस के अल्फाज में हमारी रूहानी हकीकत वो है जो हमसे हमारी फितरी खुदी के मुताबिक जीने का तकाजा करती है। क्या गुनाह की ख्वाहिशात से अलहदगी रूहानी हकीकत के करीब ले जा सकती है? डॉक्टर जेम्स ने जिक्र किया है कि जब अपने सायों पर पहलू के साथ काम करते हैं तो हम अपने आप को मुकम्मल और मुतवाज़न शख्स के तौर पर महसूस करते हैं। क्या यह अमल कारीन को एक ताकतवर लेकिन मुस्बत पहलू में बदलने का जरिया बन सकता है? कंटेम्पलेशन और मुराकबा। डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस ने जिक्र किया है कि सबसे बड़ा बोझ जो बच्चा उठाता है वो वालिदैन की नामुकम्मल जिंदगी का होता है। क्या आपके ख्याल में वालिदैन की गैर हल शुदा जज्बाती और नफ्सियाती मसाइल किस तरह बच्चों की शनाख्त को मुतासर करते हैं? Self part, your S capital self, which is unconscious, there is a concept again of, like you just mentioned, of psyche, just alluded to it. And then there's a lot of mention of Rooh being in the Arabic version or the Islamic version, the mention of Rooh descriptively coming in repeatedly parallels with the psychoanalysis. Now, yes, we're talking now two different parallels, something 1400 years ago given, and the modern psychoanalogy talking about Rooh. Could you explain a little bit about that part to us in psychoanalysis terms? How does that come about? And then we'll look at the definition of it, because you've mentioned in your books a number of times how it's an organic being, it has feelings, and it's autonomous, it's independent, and for some reason it does not go parallel with it's an organic being, but not a worldly sort of organic. It's not fulfilled. So would you Dr.
Sure.
Hollis, please explain a little bit of that concept?
Sure, and just like Rooh, the word psyche from the Greek psyche, that means it's soul. So psychopathology, pathos from the Greek is suffering, and logos is expression of. So psychopathology is the protest of the psyche when it's being ignored or violated in some way. So it's the expression of the suffering of the soul. And if you think of the soul, again, it includes our minds, our bodies, our emotions, and our spirits. So spirit comes from the Greek pneuma, which is breath, you see, and I think that's related to Ruh as well, if I understand correctly. And it's the difference between nature wishing to express itself and then being put into an artificial situation, such as our cultures are. Our commercial operations, our religious institutions, our educational institutions, our governmental institutions, and so forth. And if those systems are supportive of what the psyche wants or the soul wants, then you'll feel a sense of belonging, support, and sense of wholeness. But to the degree they're not, then there will be an internal conflict. And that's where we experience our symptomatology or psychopathology. And again, just another word about that. The word psychotherapy comes from the Greek therapoion. It means to listen or attend to. So it begins to take on a different flavor when you realize that psychotherapy is about listening or attending to the voice of the soul.
Wow.
What you might call the divine part of every person. That is to say, the transpersonal part of every human being. Now, one of the most important things that I learned in my years of analysis in Zurich, which was, shocking and to some degree devastating, is this paradox. What you've become is now your chief obstacle. Now, I need to explain that. What we become is a series of reflexive responses to the challenges of life. And patterns of compliance with the pressures of the external world, for example, or patterns of avoidance or power complexes that are compensatory and so forth. So we become our adaptations. We identify our adaptations. Sometimes we're even rewarded for our adaptations. But paradoxically, as adaptations, again, they can be splitting off from or in violation of what is wanting expression in the world through us. Just to give an obvious example, let's say a child is born with a talent, a musical talent, an artistic talent, and his family or his culture at that point does not support that in any way, may even punish him in some way. Well, what happens to that? Does it go away? No, it doesn't go away. It pathologizes as a disorder intrapsychic, and it could show up, for example, as depression. So rather than say, how quickly do we get rid of a depression from a psychoanalytic standpoint, we say, why has this come to us? What is the symptom trying to tell us? The symptom is recognizing the autonomy of the psyche that refuses to simply comply with whatever agenda is being imposed upon it, either from the culture or, from ourselves. So that's why I said it was pretty devastating to realize that what you've become, necessarily so, this is not to be judged, it's to recognize those adaptations were probably necessary to protect oneself. Because our adaptations are in service to getting our needs met as best we can as relatively powerless children and staying out of harm's way. So we learn patterns of avoidance or patterns of compliance to circumstances that are not conducive to our own emotional well-being. It's sort of like if you were forced to eat a certain food and it was not healthy for the body is going to register its dismay. And it'll increase its protest till it finally gets our attention. And that's often what brings people into psychotherapy.
Brilliant. Let me just come back to what your book about life of meaning. And you've just alluded or just touched on the word psych, Greek. And you've mentioned that it actually means to breathe in, to breathe. And I want to just quickly quote you an ayah. It's from As-Sajda 32:9. And it goes like this, just a brief. Summa savvahu nafahu fihi min ruh. Then the body was fashioned, and ruh was sort of like breathed into it. This is exactly same word. The ruh, wa nafahu fihi min ruh. Ruh was actually put into the body, and then the human was Sama'ul basaru alafida, meaning he was given sense of hearing, a sense of eyesight, and the fahm, to think as well, and a heart. This surprisingly goes in parallel to what you were just explaining right now about the ruh, and you have mentioned in your other areas of the book how it sort of flows through the body and it sort of animates it. You've mentioned that it can animate it, and it's got, like you just mentioned, it has its feeling, and it can transform where you, meaning from an initial bit to a butterfly. You quoted that in your book. So I'm coming to my question now. The question is how you think the ruh is. In the beginning, the psyche was saying Guru. You've mentioned that there is a first half of life and how in the second half of the life, if you do not nourish it, it starts to protest even more. So much so that it can lead to we'll talk about what it can do, but can you explain a little bit, do you think that the ruh, when you're young, is naive a little? It's a little abstract, but matures over a period of time, and then it starts asking the question more. When you hear, when you can think more, it demands more. Would that be a right analogy?
Certainly. And after all the traditions, great religious traditions have been looking at the same phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of humanity. So they bring their understanding of what happens to the human being and what it means to be human. So there are bound to be these important overlaps because there are going to be insights from all the great traditions about the same thing. They may use different language, different metaphors, but they're headed in the same direction. So just to back up a little bit, we are matter, we are animals. And yet the word animal, anima is Latin for soul. It's like an ensouled animal. That is to say, there's an autonomy to this, and that one of the characteristics, most of the animal kingdom, to the best of our understanding, is driven by instinct. The instinct to eat, to procreate, to protect itself from predators, etc. But as far as we know, it doesn't create religions. It doesn't create social economic systems. It doesn't suffer neuroses. It can be frightened by predators and act instinctually to protect itself, as we do, but it doesn't anticipate, let's say, its mortality in a way that humans do. And that's an important distinction. So in the first, and we say half in a very loose sense here, as children, we have one message, and that life gives us, and it's accurate actually, and that is the world is big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. So how are you going to fit in? And so we either give the world what it's asking of us, or we spend our life trying to find ways to get away from that. Either way, we're responding to that rather than something that's coming out of us, which is our natural, instinctual, and spiritual expression. So in the first half of life, we have, as children and young people, the same kinds of frustrations, but generally speaking, the continuing demand of the world is to fit in, to get an education, leave your parents, get a job, be self-supporting, form commitments in life, perhaps become a parent, all useful and social functions that are necessary to maintain a family and a society. On the other hand, at some point in one's life, and this often happens to people, as you know, they will have done all the right things as they were instructed to do so, or as they believed they were needing to do to fit in, and then something inside doesn't sort of cooperate. I myself had achieved all of my external goals by midlife, and at 35, I suffered a very serious depression. And that led me to my first hour of analysis to ask the question, if I've done all the right things, why is my psyche not cooperative? Why is it not happy too, And that began a different kind of inquiry that was, in a sense, not so much how do I fit in and how do I play the game that my culture has provided me, which I had played it to the best of my ability, but rather, why am I here, really? And in service to what? Really, and to ask another kind of question that begins to emerge in the second half of life, and that is, what is life asking of me? What is the soul asking me? Which is, say, what is the self asking of me, rather than what my ego or my complexes are asking of me? And that's a humbling experience. It doesn't make you feel great and on top of the world. It says, I have to go back to the drawing board. That's what took me into 6 years of analysis in Switzerland. It wasn't that I was planning to change my life. I wasn't planning to change my careers. I moved from academia to psychoanalysis as a therapist. It was simply to try to say, how do I get this depression to go away? But increasingly, I realized it had to do with gaining access to what was wanting a deeper expression through me, and to begin to realize some of the obstacles that I was carrying within and my adaptations. For example, one of my own adaptations in the first half of life was to begin to intellectualize things rather than to deal with the magnitude of feelings that I had. It wasn't that I was absent of feeling. It was, as a child, I felt them so strongly. I needed to defend myself against their strength. And of course, things don't go away, they go underground and come up somewhere else. And so I began to realize that in this humbling experience, I thought I'd done the right things, but my own psyche is protesting. And again, that's not something, I'm not opposed to medication under certain circumstances, but we have to question why we rush too quickly to medication and just say, well, let's have this problem go away, rather than say, why has it come to me? Is it possible that my own soul is trying to connect to me? And the word of psychoanalysis, the word analysis, again from the Greek, means to sort of loosen up from below, to loosen the constriction, allow things to come to the surface. What vegetables are at the bottom of the soup bowl? You don't know until you go down there and bring them up. And it was at that point I began to realize the importance of the feeling function. We don't choose our feelings. Our feelings are autonomous qualitative analyses of our life experience. It doesn't mean that we manufacture the feeling. In other words, having done all the right things, my feelings had revolted. How could that be? And one thing I learned was I'm not in charge of them. They're responding autonomously. Energy system is another, that if I'm doing what's right for me, the energy is there. Now, in real life, we have to mobilize energy to get up at 3 a.m. and change the baby's diaper, whatever is needed to go to work on time. But if you keep, we all know this, if you keep diverting your energy to places that are hostile to the well-being of your own soul, it's going to show up as boredom, enervation, ultimately self-medication, depression, whatever. And thirdly, dream are autonomous reactions something in the psyche knows us better than we know ourselves. And I was interested to find from sleep research that we average about 6 dreams per night. And everybody's going to say, well, I don't dream that much, and I don't remember my dreams. So it's serving some role in nature. Nature doesn't waste energy. And secondly, to really pay attention over time, you begin to realize there's an other inside of each of us that is seeking to communicate with us. And then, fourthly, is this issue of meaning, which is very nebulous. What is meaningful to one person won't be for another, but if you're in harmony with your own psyche's desires, then you'll experience whatever you're going through meaningfully. Even suffering becomes meaningful if you see its purpose for you and what it's asking of you. So ultimately, the experience of meaning is our surest guide to knowing that we are tracking the right direction for us. And for me, ironically, the world of painful feelings that I thought I could escape, I don't think it was a conscious decision. I think it was a series of adaptations. The world of painful feelings that I thought I could escape as a child through entering the life of the mind had reached up and pulled me under to bring me back to a profession where hour after hour after hour I deal with people's feelings, my own in reaction, that are often very painful, very conflictual. But I also find that work profoundly meaningful. So that I say this autobiographically simply to give illustrations. I could give you 1,000 illustrations for clients of how the thing we flee often is trying to desperately reach us to stop and pay attention, which is really the work of therapy.
डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस ने कहा कि अपनी सायादार शख्सियत के साथ सामना करना एक इख्तिलाफी अमल है ताकि ये हमारे बच्चों या माशरे पर मुंतकिल ना हो। आपकी जिंदगी खुद आ गई और अपनी हामियों को पहचानना कितना जरूरी है। डॉक्टर हॉलिस ने जिक्र किया कि साइकोथेरेपी का मकसद रूह की आवाज सुनना, कुरान में सलात के जरिए सुबह शाम रूह के साथ जुड़ने की हिदायत दी गई है। आपके नजदीक नमाज का मुराकबा से तशबीह देना कितना मौजू है? डॉक्टर जेम्स हॉलिस के मुताबिक नफ्स और रूह के दरमियान तनाज़ा जिंदगी में दाखिली तसाद पैदा करता है। मुराकबा किस तरह इन तनाज़ात को कम करके इंसान को अंदरूनी सुकून फराहम करता है। वह किस तरह इन तनाज़ात को कम करके इंसान को अंदरूनी सुकून फराहम करता है। हॉलिस ऐसे लगता है जैसे कुरान की आयत की बात कर रहा है, उसकी ट्रांसलेशन कर रहा है, और उसी तरह रूह के बारे में बता रहा है कि बॉडी है और बॉडी के अंदर किस तरह रूह फूंकी गई है। वो लफ्ज यूज कर रहे हैं, ब्रेथ इन, सांस दिया गया है उसको। और हम ये बात कर रहे हैं किसी तरह अल्लाह सुब्हानहू व तआला ने कहा है कि किस तरह उसमें उसको पैदा किया फूंक करके, और फिर जबरदस्त बात, किस तरह रूह फ्लो कर रही है और किस तरह इसके अंदर फीलिंग्स आ जाती है, और किस तरह ओवर एक अरसे के बाद अगर हम इसके इश्यूज को रूह की नशो नमा ना करें या उसको ना सुने या उसकी आवाज को ना सुने, तो किस तरह इसकी फीलिंग्स में प्रोटेस्ट ज्यादा आना शुरू हो जाता है। You mentioned how we have to make an appointment with our soul. You talk in your books about you've got to shut up, suit up, and show up, which means that mentally stop talking about other stuff, but address this issue about the call
Yes.
with your soul. If you don't do it now, it's going to eat you up from inside, or it's going to have a bearing. And then, Dr. Hollis, you also mention about how often you've got to meditate. This appointment or addressing the issue has been a form of meditation. We call it Salah, which is like going into a little prayer domain. You mentioned that it's probably twice at least a day, morning, evening. You can break that out. Could you explain a little bit when you are doing that, and if you are doing that, what are the things you've got to try to address? Just
Well, I had a colleague in Ontario, now deceased, Marion Woodman, who said she always told her clients, if you're going to work with me, you need to dedicate a minimum of 1 hour a day to spend time with yourself, to meditate, to work with your dreams, to do something that responds to your interior. And she said, most people say, oh, I don't have time for that. I don't have that time. You should.
Right.
And then she said, then you're not ready to really work with your own soul here. And I think her point is well taken here. You know, we have so many stimuli coming at us, more all the time, given the internet and the world we live in. We're bombarded. And that, by the way, is one reason why our body and our psyches have to go to bed at night, just to sort of try to process that data and restore its own perspective, you see. But I think in those moments, we have two summonses. One is to address what needs to be addressed in our world. First of all, you've always said, most of the clients who came to me, and I would find this true, at some level understood what their real task was. They've been trying to figure out all kinds of ways to avoid that, you know, to keep the appointment with your own soul, in other words. And the purpose of the therapy then was to call us back, and you used a very important word, vocation. That's different than job. Job's how you pay your bills. Vocation's what you're called to be as a human being. That's a different matter. And sometimes they can come together, but they don't have to necessarily. But the point is, we all have appointments with our own souls. Do you keep the appointment? If you don't, then it begins to pathologize. One winds up in self-medication. One winds up dealing with depression. One loads up in medications. Or one lives a life of frenetic investment in the outer world, a world of distraction. So all of these are treatment plans for the avoidance with oneself. And to be who we are, for all of us, requires some courage to step into it. So I have this de facto motto that you just cited there. It's shut up, suit up, show up. Shut up is I'm not saying it to others, I'm saying it to myself. We all have complaints. We all hurt somewhere. The older you get, the more it hurts. We all have had losses, right? Well, there are people who have life far worse. So don't whine. Just shut up about that. Recognize there are people who are having their children killed. There are people who don't have enough food tonight. There are people who have no shelter. Your problems are minimal compared to that. So shut up. Now, suit up means do your homework. Don't expect things to happen just magically. Do what you need to do to facilitate change and growth, and pay your dues. And thirdly, step into life. Show up. Not show off. Show up. Just do the best you can. Stop beating up on yourself. Just do the best you can. And I say that to myself, you know, one way or the other, every morning, as a way of saying, you know, life is not easy, but it's also rich and wonderful. And the more you bring that spirit to it, the more rewarding it gets. It doesn't mean you're in charge. It means you have to stop and pay attention and see what changes of attitudes and behaviors are obliged for you in your dealings with the outer world, but also your attitudes to your own soul, which is one reason why that time with yourself every day is so critically important. We have to pull out of the noise, pull out of the traffic to recover a sense of self. So I try to, before I work with clients every day, I spend time with myself and see what my dreams were saying the night before, or what's coming up, saying, all right, but what is that really about? You know, I'm fond of saying to clients, well, it's not about what it's about, right? We have a certain behavioral issue out here that we need to address. But it's not about that. It's what is that trying to serve intrapsychically? We don't do crazy things. We do logical things. If you can take what the behavior is and work back to its emotional premise, then you realize often that emotional premise is really fallacious. It's something that came from your history or whatever. You know, you're either serving your parents' values, or you're running from them, or whatever, but they're always present for good or for ill. But it also means that you're still caught in your adaptations rather than in a deep inquiry to say, what does the soul want of me here? So again, very basically, the first half of life, we have to develop enough ego strength to step out in the world and create a provisional, functional organism, a self, a socialized self. But then to ask the question, but what is really seeking its expression in the world through us? That is not self-absorption. It's not narcissism. It's, in fact, humbling. It means, oh, well, here's another thing I didn't know about myself. I have to pay attention to that. Oh, here's something I'm called to face. Jung put it this way. He said, there are three pieces to this work of self-healing. He said, first is insight. That's where psychology can help. But he said, from that point on, it really depends on the moral character of that individual. Second, he said, is courage to face whatever tasks life brings us. And thirdly, he said, is endurance, sticking it out over time. Insight, courage, persistence, endurance. And when we bring that to the table, we regain a sense of purpose and dignity in our lives, even if it's conflictual and difficult.
ये डॉक्टर जेम्स होलस अपने एनालिसिस में अपने आप को या अपनी अमेरिकन ऑडियंस को, अपनी वेस्टर्न ऑडियंस को समझा रहे हैं वही बातें जो हमें कितनी देर से पता है, जो हम प्रोबेबली अपनी बुक को बंद करके रख दी हुई हैं, यहाँ पे इनको खोल के दोबारा से रीस्टडी किया जा रहा है. एग्जैक्ट सेम बातें, एग्जैक्ट सेम साइकोएनालिसिस, साइकोथेरेपी का नाम दे के इंसान के इस्लाम का जो है ना कितनी इससे सिमिलैरिटीज है इसकी एनालिसिस में. तो सुनते हैं जरा आगे कि जेम्स हॉलस ने आगे से क्या बात की. About dreams, and it's one of the topics very fascinating for me as a sleep physician as well. In just one surah, Surah Yusuf sees a dream, the stars and the moons. He also had the capability of interpreting the dreams as well. The interpretations he did twice of the king who had a problem, and then also of a person who was actually in jail. But yet, the modern science differs with that. They're always mentioning about that dreams being abstract, probably like you mentioned, like they're describing as it being it's just a thought process. What's your thoughts on the dreams? Because as being a religious, reading religion, a follower, I believe that dreams have a meaning, and especially in all of the religions, other than Islam, prophets were able to see dreams. They had true meanings. They had to follow, which is a higher level of state, obviously. But every dream had a meaning. Considering Freud also tried to interpret the dreams, and a lot of them they weren't able to define a consistent pattern. I want to know, Dr. Hollis, where do you stand on the dream part, and how do humans have to address the dreams when they see something?
Sure, and first of all, we have to recognize it's a natural function of the human organism. And again, nature doesn't waste energy, so it has a purpose. We have to ask that purpose. Sleep research has also tells us if you reach 80 years old, and I'm 84, if you reach 80 years old, you have spent 6 years of your life dreaming. That's not sleeping. You'll be spending up to a third of your time sleeping, but 6 years. That's extraordinary. And I think there are two basic reasons here. First of all, is the raw experience of stimuli that come to us every day that has to be processed. Whether we pay attention or not, it's serving a natural function. And in sleep laboratories, when people have been blocked from dreaming, they can sleep as much as they want, but they are awakened the moment the brainwaves start indicating the sleep phase, or the dream phases, rather. They're awakened. And after a number of days of that, there's a tendency for them to start hallucinating. So it's as if the material in there has to be processed in some way. If it isn't, it will show up in some pathogenic way. Secondly, if you pay attention to it over time, you begin to realize, again, there's something in the psyche that's responding to our lives, what's happening to us, what our choices I just taught a course earlier this Monday of this week on dreams. I provided examples from real people. You think, who would ever make this up consciously? The autonomy of those images and the wisdom of those images that pull somebody out, say from childhood, you haven't seen for years. It's unlikely you're still processing the relationship with that child, but the psyche has reached in. It's like a movie director that goes to central casting and saying, I need to have somebody to embody this issue for this person, for this interior movie that we're having here. And what's so hard about dream interpretation is we tend to look at it strictly from the standpoint of the ego. And therefore we can be frightened by our dream. We can even try to manipulate our interpretation, so perhaps we can help avoid our shadow, or we're threatened by what it might ask of us. So the ego is not that trustworthy when it comes to dream interpretation. That's why the therapist has to work with the person to help them bring out their associations with these images. So if you and I dreamt of our grandmother this evening, and by the way, we don't create our dreams. Just try to imagine a dream about a certain subject matter. Well, your psyche's not going to pay attention. It has its own autonomy, and it's going to be responding whether you like it or not. But when a dream image comes up, we have to start saying, when I experience that image, what are the associations I have? And if you dream of your grandmother, I dream of my grandmother, well, we had different grandmothers. What aspect of our experience is the psyche pulling on? I mean, it's really detective work. You can work for hours on a single dream. Jung used to say at the beginning, he said, I have no idea what this dream is. It's a product of your psyche, but together we'll sort of process it together until such time as it begins to open the layers to us. Dreams often have various layers. And so over time, you begin to realize that there are certain motifs that follow, there are dream threads that follow. To give you a quick example, I've had several people who had very negative or traumatic experiences with a father or mother, and their dreams initially bring up the traumatic aspect of it. And over time, as you work on that, so the image of that parent begins to evolve, and so many have begun to see their parents as someone else's wounded child, or someone else who was caught in a dilemma. And what happened to the dreamer was less personal than it seemed at the time, and more coming out of the hurt of that person's experience. And you begin to see the intrapsychic image of that parent figure evolve and be more integrated. And often there's a sense of understanding, even forgiveness, that can come from that. You see, now that just doesn't happen overnight. That's why this process has to be sustained over time, because this work, think of all the daily repetitions that we went through as children, absorbing what we think are the messages of our family and our culture to us. And that doesn't just disappear overnight. It has to be assimilated. It has to be worked through. It has to be understood. And asking questions like, well, what does that experience make me do, or what does it keep me from doing? And that's a very pragmatic question. If you can address that question, all right, let's just say there's a certain fearfulness. We have a certain area of life we're called to, but we're afraid of doing it. It's coming out of our sense of having, experienced trauma around that in our life, or lack of confidence in ourselves, or whatever. I mean, everybody has self-esteem issues. Even the narcissists, they're the ones with the greatest problem with self-esteem. That, just, all right, now, what is this really asking of me? And, what does this make me do? What does it keep me from doing? And the moment you make that conscious, guess what? Now ego consciousness has a new agenda. Are you going to bring to that insight the courage and the persistence necessary to actually evolve and integrate that part of your psychological history, or is it going to be off over here and operating autonomously in your life, perhaps sabotaging your life and continuing to keep it as a prisoner of history?
मेडिटेशन के बारे में ये है, देखें कितनी जबरदस्त बात जेम्स हॉलिस कर रहा है कि जेम्स कह रहा है कि आपको रोज रूह को एड्रेस करना है। और हमारे हमारे नबी ने हमें बता दिया था कि अगर आप नमाज पढ़ रहे हैं ना, तो आपका नमाज से अल्लाह को कोई फायदा नहीं है, आपको अपना इसका फायदा है। और इसका हमें फ़ायदा वैसे सोचा जाए तो हर वक्त जब हम सजदे में जाते हैं तो हम रूह की नशो नमा कर रहे हैं, अपने अंदर को नशो नमाज को दे रहे हैं। और जब रूह मुतमईन होती है तो हमारे हार्मोन्स, हमारे अंदर की जो सारी साइकी बॉडी सब फिजियोलॉजी है ना, उसमें सुकून आता है। और जेम्स को जब हमने कहा कि जेम्स क्या ये डॉक्टर जेम्स को जब हमने कहा कि डॉक्टर जेम्स क्या नमाज भी कोई रोल अदा कर सकती है, तो वो कह रहे हैं एब्सोल्युटली कर सकती है, वही रूल अदा कर सकती है। Interesting as well because it also talks about yudhibana sayya, which essentially means the negativity, the thoughts that are there. You got to try to wipe them out. In this specific case, it talks about your negative sins, negative things that you've accumulated, because when you are doing that, you're establishing a little connection. Which brings us to our next bit, is about talking about the shadow, or addressing what we call the Qareen. Qareen is like your, I want to phrase it a little cautiously, devilish part. The part that we have to be mindful about. وَمَنْ يَعْشُ, there's another quote, ayah 43:36, which talks about if we, and whoever turns a blind eye to the reminders, he will be at the disposal then of the Qareen, the disposal of the devilish one, close to him. And then it specifically says, Shaitanun fahuwa lahu Qareen. You'll become more near to that part of the shadow of the Qareen. You, Dr. Hollis, also talk about that a lot in your therapy analysis. Would you explain how do we connect that? What's your connection here with the shadow, and how do we have to dispel that off with constant reminder, with the meditation, that this exists and needs to be addressed, just like the Rooh wants something?
Sure. And you know, there's a paradox here. What we don't address inside of ourselves gets spilled onto our children, to our partners, to our society. So there's a deep moral function in looking at one's own shadow. Because if I don't address it in some way, it keeps spilling into the world onto others. And that's a harmful thing to do to others. That's why Jung said once, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. Wherever the parent has been stuck in their shadow, the child inherits that and often has to either repeat it, which is common, or spend their life trying to get away from it. But basically, the shadow represents those parts of ourselves that when we finally make them conscious, if we're not conscious of them, they just keep spilling into the world. If we are forced to become conscious of them, or we invite that dialogue, then we realize that many of the things we do are in service to, say, motives or agendas that are not comfortable to us, or maybe inconsistent with our values. To give some quick examples, maybe the part of me that just made a major decision is really driven by my fears. I can't help having fears, that's human. But you don't want your life governed by your fear responses, right? That's a shadow issue. So if I'm going to unhook my decisions in the outer world, I'm going to have to face my fears. And you can see why that's a reason to keep all of that underground, because I don't want to do that. And that's why it has that autonomy. Or maybe some of my motives are really selfish and manipulative, and I don't want to look at myself in that light. But then again, those behaviors continue to bring harm to those around us. Or maybe it's coming out of my insecurity that I'm seeking to demonstrate something with someone else, or control or manipulate them or something. One of the wisest things said about this was from the Roman playwright Terence, who many millennia ago, or 2.5 millennia ago, nothing human is alien to me. So it's easy for me to say, well, I can see all your flaws, but I'm not capable of seeing mine. I know who the enemy is. It's you, right? And groups always project their own shadow onto other groups, as we know throughout history. And it's sad and lethal, sadly, at times. But, to say nothing human is alien to me means I have to recognize all the what you call devilish capacities, the capacity for evil, capacity for functions like jealousy, envy, control and manipulation, and so forth. And if I could begin to look at them, then I'm going to stop criticizing you because I've got so much work to do on myself, you see. That's why this work is not narcissism and not self-absorption. It's about being accountable. That's the central thing. That's one of the most important words I could use here is accountability. In the second half of life, as we begin to look at our history and to see some of those patterns. I mean, none of us wake up in the morning and says, well, today I'm going to do the same harmful or stupid things I've done for a long time, but we will if we stay on automatic pilot here. But to begin to say, all right, but where is that coming from in you? I often ask clients to examine, a certain impulse or behavior or pattern. What is that in service to inside of you? That's the key. Because one of the characteristics of shadow is we usually have, when we have to start dealing with it in some way, a ready defense or rationalization. Well, I did this because you did that, or because you didn't do that, I did this. You see, in other words, I'm disowning any responsibility for this. Freud talked about a young man who tried to disown his own dreams. He said, but, there were things in my dreams I would, that are not me. And Freud said, well, whose dream do you think you were just talking about? It was your dream. Your psyche embodied this. You see. Well, that's shadow work. And it's, again, not self-absorption. It's how I began to find a kind of ecology with my own soul. And I'm less likely to be operating on these automatic responses, and I'm going to be a different person for people to have to live with. You see, so the greatest task we can do for others is to work on our own shadow. Because one thing is clear to me, and I wrote about this in the book on relationship, is that no relationship with another person can be more evolved than our relationship to ourselves. Because where I'm stuck, where I'm blind, where I'm refusing to be accountable, it's going to play out with the other person sooner or later. And that's why I keep looking to the other person to fix this or something like that, when in fact the work that I have to do is my own work. That's the best thing I can do.
वेस्ट में लोगों के पास टाइम ही नहीं है चर्च में जाने के लिए, लेकिन वो ये भी कह रहे हैं कि नहीं, आप मेडिटेट करो, अपने अंदर की आवाज को सुनो और समझो कि आपको क्या आवाज, कौन सी चीज आप गलत कर रहे हो लाइफ में जो आपको पुकार ये आ रही है कि अपने आप का रास्ता चेंज करो। और उसके मुताबिक वो ये कह रहा है कि आप रोज करें इसको। नमाज का भी ये सिलसिला है कि सुबह शाम जो नमाज है और बीच में जो है ये आपके लिए ये मेडिटेशन है और आपकी जिंदगी को सोचने का मौका देना चाहिए कि मेरी डायरेक्शन ठीक है कि नहीं। ड्रीम्स के बारे में डॉक्टर जेम्स का कॉन्सेप्ट बिल्कुल उसी तरह क्लियर है जैसे हम ये बात कर रहे हैं। जो मॉडर्न स्लीप है ना, वो कहती है कि ड्रीम्स रैंडम है, ड्रीम्स का कोई बेस नहीं है, ड्रीम्स बेमैनी है। लेकिन जो जंगियन साइकोथेरेपी है वो ये कह रही है कि ड्रीम्स की आवाज को सुनो, ये कोई पुकार है अंदर से, ये कोई कनेक्शन पैदा करना चाह रही है, ये एनर्जी वेस्टफुल एनर्जी नहीं है, ये मीनिंगफुल एनर्जी है, यानी कि ड्रीम्स का वजूद है। और हमारे लिए भी जो मॉडर्न साइंस के बरक्स कुरान भी इसी तरह से हमें समझाने की कोशिश कर रहा होता है कि ड्रीम्स का कोई ना कोई मैनी होता है और बॉडी में उसको सुनना, उसकी तरफ कॉन्टेम्पलेट करना यानी सोचना गलत बात नहीं है। और ये डॉक्टर हॉलिस के मुताबिक ये एक वेज ऑफ कम्युनिकेशन है। तो ड्रीम्स के बारे में भी हमने थोड़ा सा आगे से एक्सप्लेन भी किया है, हमारे कुछ और लेक्चर्स के बारे में भी हमने फर्दर इसके बारे में रोशनी डाली हुई है कि कैसे ड्रीम्स आते हैं, क्यों आते हैं और उनका क्या मकसद है। और हम क्या सीख सकते हैं। ड्रीम्स तो कई तरह से आए हैं। हजरत यूसुफ इंटरप्रिटेशन करते थे, माहिर थे ड्रीम्स को इंटरप्रिटेशन इसकी करने में, इनका कोई वजूद है और इनका कोई एनालिसिस है? तो सुनते हैं नेक्स्ट पार्ट क्या है. To do that dream connection to ourselves, our nafs, if we are able to address our shadow and our Qarayeen, or make sure that our Rooh psyche is being nourished in the right direction. There is a word, if all of these are, if there is a word mentioned in Arabic, it's called Sakeena, peace, tranquility, to the extreme that comes to it, because now the body and the Rooh are both energies that are working in the same direction. And the nafs itself, there is another ayah 89:20 says ya ayyatuhan nafsun mutmain, and then the nafs itself, the ego also becomes mutmain, meaning satisfied, meaning that it's also at peace. So the aim is try to align all of these things together. Doctor, would that be when you think that a human being as be able to face now the death ultimate,
yes,
as well with ease?
Well, certainly, in the Western world, as you know, we have this word neurosis became a term that was invented in the 1790s by a Scottish physician, and they thought it was because your neurology was disturbed in some way that we have emotional symptoms. Well, to get around the notion of neurology, we have to say what we've called neurosis is really the split between my adaptations, the acculturation, and the natural desire of the self to express itself in the world through me. Now, the more I can bring those two together, the greater I'm going to have a sense of purposefulness, sense of harmony, and so forth. And this is an ongoing work, because whatever we might achieve momentarily can get out of balance as we have to deal with the challenges of life very, very quickly. So this is, a daily vigilance, a daily paying attention. And of course, part of this work slowly begins to reposition that ego, because the fear of death is all the ego's fear. It's not nature's issue. I've had the experience and the sorrow of being with people who died and animals who were pets that died. And generally speaking, pets had no fear. It was a natural process for them. They were in harmony with their nature, or certainly more than humans are. It's like the more one is identified with ego fantasy of control and sovereignty, the more it's going to feel the threat of its own existence. The more it begins to be repositioned in the larger framework of the dialogue with the soul, the less identified it's going to be. Now, as I sit here at this moment, at 84, and I'm living in a retirement center at this moment, I'm in the midst of death, or in the midst of life, we are death, as the old saying has it. Well, it's all around me. I can't say that I want to die. In fact, one of my chief reasons for staying alive is I happen to love my wife. I want to be there for her. She needs my help. Secondly, I'm still curious about the world. I'm still enjoying learning so much about the world. It breaks your heart at times, but you're still learning about the world. But there's a part of me, too, that is perfectly accepting of this. I do understand. We're, as Jung put it, this is a short pause between two great mysteries. So it's not about what the mystery is. That's the mystery. It's what we come from and what we enter into as mystery. The question is, have you lived your life as honestly as you could while you were here? Did you step into it? When Jung said we all walk in shoes too small for us, what he meant was we become our protective adaptations. And that's understandable. But the more we live that, the more we're playing out of our powerless past. The less we're identified with the ego and more with the soul, the more we're likely to realize, the ego is a passing phenomenon. From whence and whither do? We don't know, but respect the mystery. And in doing so, I think it helps us get away from the urgencies of the ego that says, but I'm the boss and I must be in control and so forth. And so autonomy of the body, aging, mortality are the ultimate, confrontations with that ego fantasy of being the boss. It's a tiny cluster of energy and a large ocean. And rather than be threatened by that, realize that's the life force that's been carrying me through this. And that's part of the mystery. And I feel that very, very strongly. I'm not afraid of dying. I wouldn't be happy to suffer a lot of pain, to be honest. And I've had a lot of recent years because of surgeries, but it's not death that I fear. And what I fear is not living my life with meaning and purpose is what I fear. And that's where I'm accountable to myself and my own soul on a daily basis.
So करीन का कॉन्सेप्ट जो है वो इस्लाम में बड़ा नुमाया तौर पे पाया जाता है। मॉडर्न साइकोथेरेपी उसका नाम शैडो दे रही है। शैडो को ये एक उसकी मुशाबत कर रही है डेविलिश फीलिंग से। हर इंसान के अंदर, हर रूह के नफ्स के अंदर एक नेगेटिव आवाज आ रही है, जो डॉक्टर हॉलिस भी एक्सप्लेन कर रहे हैं। आपको उसको एड्रेस करना है, यानी उसका मुकाबला भी करना है, उसको कंट्रोल में भी रखना है और उसको अपने पॉजिटिव कामों पे असरअंदाज नहीं होने देना। सो शैडो कारीन जो इंसान के साथ साथ चलती हैं, ये उनको बकाया एक ऑर्गेनिक फीलिंग्स दे रहे हैं कि ये एग्जिस्ट कर रही है उसी तरह से जैसे हमें बताया गया कि इस्लाम में ये एग्जिस्ट कर रही है। सो जो साइकोथेरेपी साइकोएनालिसिस ये करती हैं, ये बकाया तौर पे ट्रीटमेंट के तौर पे बताते हैं कि आपको कारीन को एड्रेस करना है, आपके शायद शोल्डर पे या किसी जगह पे ये फीलिंग्स को कंट्रोल करना है। इसलिए जेम्स हॉलिस की बातें जो है वो बहुत ज़्यादा इंटरेस्टिंग है और बहुत ज़्यादा मज़ेदार है कि इतनी सिमिलैरिटीज़ हैं कि इंसान जो है ना वो हैरान होना शुरू हो जाता है कि नफ्सियाती तौर पे यानी कि साइकी और इसकी एनालिसिस या जिस पे ये सारी अपनी इमारत इन्होंने खड़ी की है और उसके बाद इन्होंने ये ट्रीटमेंट करते हैं। जो डॉक्टर हॉलिस हैं वो एक्टिव प्रैक्टिस भी करते हैं लोगों को क्लैरिटी ऑफ थॉट्स देने के लिए और इन मेंटल वेल बीइंग के लिए। तो इसके साथ मुझे और रानी चैट जीपीटी को इजाज़त दें। हम आपकी खिदमत में फिर दोबारा हाजिर होंगे। अगर आपको ये शो पसंद आ रहा है तो प्लीज़ इसको लाइक, सब्सक्राइब और शेयर करें और हमारी ऑडियंस को और रानी जीपीटी को फीडबैक देना ना भूलिएगा। अस्सलाम वालेकुम, टेक केयर।
मेरी तरफ से, डॉक्टर खान की तरफ से और रानी चैट जीपीटी की तरफ से हमें इजाजत दीजिए। आप सबका बहुत शुक्रिया। खुदा हाफिज। अगर आपको ये शो पसंद आया है तो प्लीज इसे शेयर करें, अपने कमेंट्स लिखें और सब्सक्राइब करें।